Train on its approaches to Kingsbridge Station in the days when steam engines were a regular part of life in the South Hams. This Aarchive 8mm cine footage captured by Reg Sampson is a reminder of how rail commuter life used to be in one of the most picturesque areas of Devon. The memories of the 12-mile journey from Brent, winding its way through the beautiful Avon Valley, still lives on in the hearts and minds not only of locals but of people from all over the UK, and as we shall see later, from as far away as Australia. What has been affectionately referred to by some as the Primrose Line is indeed rich in legend, and from the archives of the Cookworthy Museum in Kingsbridge, these images are a reminder of the humble beginnings of the construction work. After a number of false starts and at a cost of £180,000, including the building of 48 bridges, the official opening of the branch took place on the 19th of December 1893. On that day, the 8:45 a.m. from Brent had a distinguished passenger list, including Viscount Emlyn, Colonel Edgecombe and Mr. Hubbard, all directors of the GWR. At each station stop, excited crowds were waiting to greet the train. It was the beginning of an era, and from that day onwards an object of lasting devotion had established itself on the landscape. Local dignitaries lined the platform at Kingsbridge as the band of the King's Own Scottish Borderers provided the music. The GWR had allocated 1,000 free tickets as a marketing exercise, and children were not allowed aboard. That same Mr. Huxham, who saw the splendour of the first train, also witnessed the passing of the last one on the 14th of September 1963. A shabby BR diesel unit made its last journey, the memory of which was conscripted to the archives of history. This was the end of an era. The mainline track from Exeter to Plymouth branched at Brent for the 12-mile run to Kingsbridge. Running under the main A38 road, the line picked up the River Avon for the next 8 miles. Avonwick Station was in no man's land, situated between Avonwick and Ditford in Becknoll. Then onto a wooded valley, after having crossed the river a number of times, into Gara Bridge Station, just over 5 miles from Brent. The valley then opens up to the west with thick woods to the east, and still following the River Avon runs into Loddiswell Station, a mile away from the village of the same name. On then to Sorley Tunnel, and finally into the terminus at Kingsbridge, perched high above the town on a hillside beside the Salcombe Road. This then was the journey's end. The early history of the Kingsbridge branch is shrouded with considerable controversy. The Bristol and Exeter Railway completed its line from London on the 1st of May 1844, and at that time it was the longest stretch of line in the land at 194 miles. On the 4th of July 1844, royal assent was given to the South Devon Railway Company to construct the line all the way to Plymouth. On the 30th of May 1846, Teignmouth was opened. Newton Abbot followed on the 30th of December in that year. Totnes on the 20th of July 1847, and finally Plymouth on the 2nd of April 1849. But things could well have been different. for when Isambard Kingdom Brunel surveyed the Exeter to Plymouth section in 1836, the motive power then available was incapable of dealing with the heavy gradients of the shorter route around the southern edges of Dartmoor. The South Devon Railway was in favour of linking centres of population on an alternative western route. From Exeter, the line would go direct to Torquay. Then spanning the Dart would move into Dartmouth. Then on to Tor Cross. Around Kingsbridge for Salcombe. On to the town of Modbury. And finally into Plymouth. Had this route been chosen, it is likely that Kingsbridge would have a rail connection even today. Kingsbridge, apparently of Saxon origin, had a history associated with transportation. The demand for food ensured the development of agriculture in the area of the South Hams, and Kingsbridge became its focal point, with a busy seaport teeming with sailing schooners loading wool, tools, ropes and building materials. Then there was the brewing of cider and beer, textile and flour mills. The Kingsbridge estuary, in the later part of the 18th century, was teeming with ships of all shapes and sizes, waiting to discharge their cargoes of coffee, tobacco, sugar, timber and grain, amongst other important merchandise. No wonder then that the rail link was so important to this little town. With it came the day tripper and holiday maker, and a steady tourist industry began to grow to enrich the community. March 1997, and a book called The Kingsbridge Branch is being launched at the Harbour Bookshop. Dermot Reynolds and Ken Williams, after many years of careful research, signed copies on the day of release. Demand is high. The line was greatly loved by people from all over the country. But why such interest still in something that had ceased nearly 30 years earlier?
I think mainly because people regarded it as part of their holiday. They got off the mainline train at Brent and then they joined the branch train. And the branch train was actually the start of their holiday. They were going somewhere, they were ending up in Kingsbridge. And Kingsbridge, they might go on to one of the other coastal areas, but to them, Kingsbridge was part of their holiday. And I think that's why people over the years have always remembered this as a wonderful sunny South Devon holiday, started on the Kingsbridge branch.
The station at Kingsbridge was perched on land rising above the town. A distinctive curved main platform with an engine release road and bay platform extended to a loco shed and a small carriage enclosure. The busy goods yard was accessed by way of several roads. The locomotives had to climb a curved embankment with a 1 in 50 gradient when leaving on the up journey towards Sorley. Today, an industrial estate has obscured almost all traces of the once busy rail terminus, but at the end of the estate the old goods shed still stands as a reminder of the way things used to be. Shrouded in fencing and wire, the buildings stand empty, but what a story they could tell. After a careful and lengthy search, the images you are about to see were provided by Paul Johnson. With avid affection for the line, his collection of old cine film footage reawakens nostalgic memories for those who remember how it used to be. With the use of other old cine footage of different trains at different times, we can now relive the journey to Brent, stopping to compare the old with the new. Leaving Kingsbridge, the journey moves up the embankment and onto a single track at the start of the Avon Valley, and soon to reach Sorley Tunnel on the approaches to Loddiswell. The building of the 625-yard-long tunnel was a major feat of engineering. Today, the tunnel stands as a preserved monument of the line, and it is still possible to visit after navigating a steep path from Sorley Farm at the top, after having obtained permission from its owners. At certain times, a walk into the hollow darkness to the other end will invoke memories by all who knew and loved the line. Back in the early 1890s, Mr. W. Clark, as engineer appointed by the GWR, encountered major problems during its construction. There were several freshwater springs in the hillside, and on several occasions the workforce had to face setbacks from serious flooding. The building of the line required the services of navvies, and their main residential base was near here. Reports indicate that the tranquility of the South Hams, in this area particularly, was often shattered by drunken navvies who involved themselves in fights. Poaching was rife, and one Thomas Walling was found guilty of stealing detonators to throw into the River Avon in order to stun and poach the fish. He was sentenced to 2 months' hard labour and transported to prison in Exeter that very day. Another labourer, Richard Johns, was caught with a sheep on his back. When challenged, his defence was that he had just rescued it from the bramble bush. He was fined. At the farm above, the owners have created a visitor and activity centre for families to come and enjoy an afternoon out. The railway still holds a fascination for both locals and visitors to the area, and after a snack and an attempt on the trampoline, children and guests are able to walk down a steep pathway, braving the undergrowth and muddy track to the tunnel approach. At certain times of the year, those who are brave enough can walk into the dark hollow of the tunnel, where the thunder of trains and smell of the steam used to fill the air. Back in the latter part of the 19th century, with the growing number of navvies on the construction site, poaching became a problem. But it was not only the navvies that found novel ways to poach the fish. Many folk from up the line came for the sport too. Bailiffs employed by the landowners patrolled their respective beats because of the lucrative trade. And it was not long before enterprising poachers had chatted up the train crews, asking them to work out an advanced warning system. This worked well. A whistle system was perfected and the train crews were suitably rewarded. Everyone was happy. Kingsbridge fortunately suffered very little from air raids during World War II, but one evening, the 7:45 p.m, heading for Brent, came under attack from a German bomber whose pilot presumably thought that this line was a major railhead and set out to destroy it. Train driver Dunn, having heard the sound of the aircraft, immediately knew that his train was the target. He slammed on the regulator and at full steam headed for the cover of the tunnel. As he entered its enclosure, the sound of the bombs exploding at the top of the tunnel could be heard, but he had saved the day and the lives of his passengers. Leaving Sorley Tunnel, the train followed the River Avon toward the next station, Loddiswell, situated in the lower valley. Opened on the 19th of December 1893, it was in fact nearer to the parish of Woodley, the village of Loddiswell being a hard mile's walk away and mostly uphill. The platform was on a slight curve, and a regular feature in later years was the presence of camping coaches where enthusiasts could enjoy a railside holiday, courtesy of the GWR and later British Rail. Today the station building has been lovingly restored by Sheila Bolam and used as a private dwelling. Sheila has made a serious study of the line and its operations and remembers with affection some of the local experiences which she often relates to walkers and visitors as she serves them tea under the restored station canopy.
So it was Harry's idea. If we were becoming a public attraction, we thought, well, we might as well sit them down, because I spend a lot of my time talking to people. I like people, and most people are interested in a sort of caring, loving sort of way, and of course this side of the house is private from the road, So we started giving people a cup of tea, and that led to a cup of tea and a biscuit, and we gave them a bit more of our time, and then we thought, well, there's a need here, there's a service. So we obtained permission from the local council to offer them cream teas in the garden, and it went from there. And it's a very interesting and absorbing hobby. They get something, we get something, and hopefully everybody goes away happy.
On then towards Gara Bridge, just over 5 miles from Brent. The train winds and twists its way through the beautiful countryside, roaring across bridges and the River Avon a number of times before reaching Topsham Crossing with its distinctive ground frame building and private dwelling for the gatekeeper. The only crossing place on the branch was at Gara Bridge, Gara apparently being a Celtic word meaning rough, and the station was one of the most picturesque on the old GWR, lying in the rough wooded valley with the river flowing adjacent under a stone humpback road bridge. Alongside the level crossing was the signal box, almost identical to the one at Kingsbridge, but containing 24 levers plus full wheels and locking devices to control the safety gates. Today, the station house is in private hands, and whilst little remains of the railway itself, the track can still be seen. And there are other reminders of its connection with the railway. The bay where camping coaches provided accommodation for rail-loving holidaymakers is still a distinctive feature, and the surrounds have certainly lost none of their beauty. It was here at Gara Bridge that children were brought to catch the train to school in Kingsbridge. On the return journey, any bad behaviour was rewarded with the offender having to walk home. It was here also in 1958 that a serious storm developed with heavy rain and gale-force winds. A tree had blown onto the line, and the station master at Gara Bridge battled the elements after donning his gumboots and sou'wester to investigate. On arrival at the station, he discovered that the electric train staff was defective, and summoning the lineman, Vic Poole, from Brent, the party set off with suitable tilly lamps down the line to find the train. It was almost midnight before normal service could be restored, and the following morning commuters were completely unaware of the hectic activity during the previous night. As the train continued northward towards Brent, there was a succession of reverse curves which carried the line into a wooded area. From spring to autumn, the hillside, woodlands and white-painted farm buildings within the lush green pastures of the Avon Valley portrayed an idyllic setting for this much-loved Devonshire branch line as it approached the last station before Brent, Avonwick. Opened in December of 1893, this station was between the villages of Avonwick and Ditford, in no man's land really. While small, the building had its own booking office, waiting room and small goods shed, but in its later years was relegated to an unstaffed halt. Today the station has been converted to an attractive private dwelling, owned by Bob Gale, who we shall hear from later. For once, the famous Dr. Beeching couldn't be blamed for the demise of this branch line. Rumours of its closure were rife from as early as 1962. And by then the average passenger yearly bookings had dropped from just under 22,500 in 1957 to around 13,500, and British Rail had been talking about annual projected losses of some £22,000. There was a painful increase in road traffic, and all over the country many branch lines were suffering. Their operational costs could no longer be subsidised, and that was that. Despite the packed 9:10 a.m. through train from Kingsbridge to Paddington reported as late as the 31st of August 1963, the line was no longer viable for British Rail. And finally, the last 2.5 miles into the main line station at Brent, where commuters could meet up with the expresses to other parts of the UK. Brent Station was first opened in 1848, and with the opening of the Kingsbridge branch in 1893 was upgraded to facilitate expansion, including the laying of double track. The entire station was situated between two road bridges under the shadow of Brent Hill on the edge of the village. At the height of services on the GWR, this was a very busy station, complete with goods yard and all usual services for the commuter. Just 12 months after the demise of the Kingsbridge branch, this once busy mainline junction was closed in October of 1964, but only after a long, hard battle by the locals to keep it open. All that remains today is the former goods shed, which is used as an industrial premises, and the prominent signal box on the remains of the downside platform, which is used as a somewhat luxurious PW cabin. Daily the HST expresses thunder by, totally oblivious of the important part this station played in the history of the Kingsbridge branch. Only memories of those special days now remain.
I understand by second hand that the newspapers used to arrive on the train at South Brent, and if you were crafty you could have your pick of the Sunday newspapers, read them between South Brent and Kingsbridge, whence they were collected in again, carefully rearranged and delivered to the local newsagents in what looked like a pristine condition. One of the locomotive staff used to let his wife know quite clearly when he was approaching the vicinity by making the train sort of make a sort of cuckoo sound on its whistle, so that his wife knew that he was getting close to home, and she could no doubt pour the gravy over the meat and have dinner ready when he walked in through the door. The guard or one of the station staff used to stop and feed his chickens. It didn't take long to do, so the train made up a bit time as it approached Sorley Bank. In fact, when we were clearing the garden we found the remnants of the chicken run.
On our journey into the archives of time, it was evident that some enthusiasts had made it their lifelong ambition to preserve part of our local rail heritage. Here at Avonwick we were pleased to meet Bob Gale, whose time, resources and energy had been expended in the restoration of the old GWR building to its former glory as a lovely dwelling house. We asked Bob about the purchase of the station.
I bought it for just under £5,000, complete with 6 acres of land. It was in a very dilapidated state. The railways had been gone for 7 years. The line prior to that, it was an unmanned halt for 7 years. So we'd had 14 years where everybody could come down, thieve everything that they wanted to thieve, dump everything that they didn't want, and leave us quite a nice mess. And that they hadn't done, the blackberry bushes did for us. So we came in, we bought it, and my main concern was I wanted to keep it. Being a Great Western man and owning 2 Great Western steam engines, I wanted to keep it as a Great Western station, but at the same time, bearing in mind I've got to live in it, so it's got to be a nice mix match between the two. And I think that we've achieved it. We've kept the platform there with the canopy and everything looking like it was. Unfortunately, when we came in, the canopy where we've got now the nice barge board cut to the Great Western design was all corrugated iron. That was the first thing that we took off and threw away, and I had those made at £1, 10 shillings each, and there's quite a few of them, so that was one of the most expensive things. We then went to put a damp course in it because we couldn't find one, so I had £1,000 worth of damp course put round it, bearing in mind that that's now nearly a fifth of what I paid for the building. We then, having got the damp course in, we then started to do the renovation, and we took out the floors, had 6 foot depth underneath them, and they were wooden, so I wanted to take those out and put in solid floors. And the first thing we found was a nice 3/4 inch pitch damp course. So there's £1,000 I've wasted. But we carried on, we converted. We finally signed for it in October, but British Railways, on the basis that if I walked away from it, anything that I did was to an advantage, allowed me to come in, and they allowed me to start work. And start work we did, and we worked constantly with me commuting between here and London, and we moved in the following May. Well, when we came in, I mean, a lot of the doorways we've put windows in, some of the walls we've knocked down, some of the where there were walls we've put doors, and vice versa. But what I will say is that we threw nothing away. All of the doors that we took out were put into doorways that didn't exist and are still in the building to this day. The windows, they didn't exist, they were gone, so that they were made new. And again, we've tried to keep them in line with how the station looked when it was built, but bearing in mind that, of course, because living in there and being as close as we are to the river there, it really suffers with damp. We've double glazed. And there were 2 lovely sliding doors in there. One, unfortunately, had been so badly damaged and was eaten away with dry rot that we just had to throw it away. But the other one, we made into a feature and is used as a curtain. I must be the only person that heaves across one major door, and I call major, to draw the curtains. When I become old later, whether I'll be able to pull it across is anybody's guess. But no, we've thrown away nothing. Yes, we've collected a lot. A lot of people have come down and given us a lot. People have given me the last day train tickets. We've got some of the signs that were further down the line. There's also a lot of Great Western signs in there that weren't there. I've been transport orientated. I have collected a lot in my time, and most of them are still in there now to this day. So we've had to bring the telephone in, we've had to lay the water on, we've had to do the main drainage, and these, when we moved in, weren't done.
Avonwick Station House is known throughout the UK, and Bob and his wife receive curious visitors regularly, but only by appointment. The importance and indeed magic of our railway heritage lives on in the hearts and minds of those dedicated to its preservation, and this is so evident here in this area where there are still remnants of the old Kingsbridge branch line. Sheila Bolam is also an ardent railway enthusiast with a fascinating story to tell. She visited Loddiswell in the 1970s, saw the old station and fell in love with it. She explains what impelled her to buy the old derelict GWR building.
We were looking originally for a piece of land on which to build a house, and we saw this building and it seemed to be wanted to be looked after. It seemed that it wanted loving, and like any tourist we poked our nose in and had a look round and more or less fell in love with the place from that point onwards. At that time the gentleman who owned it didn't want to sell it at all, so we asked him if he would take our name down on a list, and he said yes. He had a long list of up to 20 people and he would consider it. A year later, when we'd already bought a house, we received a note through the door to say that a local estate agent was now selling Loddiswell Station and were we interested. Of course we were, but by that time we were heavily committed. I went down to the estate agents to find the details, and it suddenly occurred to me that I had about £25 in my pocket, which was the housekeeping money for the week. So I tentatively gave him that as a deposit on Loddiswell Station, not wondering what we were going to do next. I then rang my father in the northeast of England, asked him if he would loan me a considerable amount of money. Dad thought this was shocking that his daughter should ask for so much and thought I was in trouble with the police, until I explained that in fact I wanted to buy a house. The money came practically by return of post, and to the surprise of the estate agent we were able to go down almost 2 days later and say yes, we had the money, and by virtue of me placing that instant deposit on the counter we were considered as the first option buyers, and that's how we got Loddiswell Station. It was what we would call a Devon derelict. It was practically as it was the day the railway company moved out. A little bit forlorn. The windows had been boarded up with tin. It stood looking rather weary, but the structure was so good that you could tell that there was a lot of life in the old girl yet. We had huge keys to open the big padlocks on the doors, and when we threw back the doors, inside it was just step back into time, I would say. The old ledger pockets were still there, the ticket office panel was still there, the decorated hand basins, the Victorian decorated hand basins in the loos, they're all there, but sadly somebody had taken a sledgehammer to some parts, so they were irretrievable. And we just took it from there. We used to play games. We used to have friends up for barbecues, and we treated it like a toy at first. We bought it in 1971 and moved in 1973. We did most of the demolition. Myself, my ex-husband and a team of good friends did most of the demolition, which is in fact the hardest part, because we had to demolish some of the old parts to renew the building because of building regulations and planning law. The old place was so well built that knocking it down was a monumental task. So we did most of the demolition, and then a local builder rebuilt the parts which we wanted with skills which we couldn't sort of muster ourselves, and it took 2 years. We found, buried in the undergrowth, the old station boundaries. Every station had its boundary signs. These are plaques which you'll see when I take you into the house, which we've embedded in the walls of the house. They were in fact welded onto 3 or 4 foot of track and sunk deeply into the ground, and in one case, to get these off, we had to go up into the woods regularly with 2 hacksaws and do about 1/8 of an inch a day until eventually we retrieved them, and we've put them inside the house because we think they should be preserved there. Over the years also I've had people who took things away from the station site when the railway eventually disappeared, and have returned them to me because they've found out that I honour the heritage of the station, And they've even knocked on the door and asked me, are you the owner? I think you ought to have these back. I took them from your platform many years ago before the British Railways Board got their hands on them. So in that way I've preserved quite a bit of what was here originally.
From all over the UK and indeed the world, visitors arrive in the South Hams each year to observe its beauty. A favourite pastime is walking part of the old railway track, but in 1980 two visitors from Tasmania, Australia came to the South Hams with a specific mission. Since the late 70s, Rob Williamson had been working on a scale model of the Kingsbridge branch at his home in Ferntree, Tasmania. The aim was to construct all 5 stations in miniature. Using various photographs as templates obtained from the British Rail Western region was not enough, so Bob and his wife Maureen decided to obtain first-hand information and visited the South Hams, where they called at Sheila's house and asked if they could see the back garden.
At the time I was in my house on my own, and of course I thought there was 2 people casing the joint. I sent them away, didn't try to rumble them too much, asked them where they were staying, took it all in, noted it mentally, and then spoke to my neighbour, who at the time was a producer for the BBC Spotlight programme. Being a journalist with an itchy nose, he immediately went and rooted out the Williamsons at the guest house where they were staying, rang me up and said these people are genuine, they weren't too sort of, it wasn't Burglar Bill and his apprentice, and please can we come back with the Williamsons and do a little sort of feature on you. And that they did, and we left it at that, and I discovered to my horror that in fact to my horror and delight, that in fact this was a true story, which was rather wonderful. So you see, the line has got to the antipodes.
During the production of this documentary, we contacted Rob and Maureen at their last known address. It was 17 years since Sheila had met them, and we were not sure if they still lived there. Surprisingly, in January of 1997, a package arrived containing the images you have just seen. Many fine experiences were related to us during the making of this film, and we're convinced that the Kingsbridge Line must have been one of the most loved of all branch lines in the West Country. Some experiences were quite humorous, like the story of branch engine driver Ron Canham, who drove the last full steam service train out of Kingsbridge and had the distinction of driving the first diesel car unit number 55017 at the time of the changeover from steam to diesel. The story goes that despite Ron's frantic attempts, he could not persuade this fiendish new device to draw away from the station. All the right buttons were pressed, the main control opened, but no go. It was not before checking the unit from end to end that our Ron found the brake release handle in his pocket. Then they were off. Ah well, that was progress. But there are sad experiences and memories too. And with the closing of the line in September of 1963, an era had passed and British Railways wasted no time in sending in the demolition men. But feelings were running high, and Mr. T. Roach was actively endeavouring to obtain support of the Joint Railway Committee of both Kingsbridge and Sulcombe Urban District Councils with a view to taking over the running of the branch privately. The idea was to keep the line open in the winter as a local commuter service and run as a tourist attraction in the summer. Whilst courtesy prevailed during final negotiations with British Rail, the Contracts Department at Paddington was moving quickly to send in scrap metal and lifting contractors, even whilst talks were continuing in an effort to purchase the preserved line. Mr. Roach met 3 local councils in Kingsbridge in 1963, and they gave their undertaking that they would take over the line. Funds of some £20,000 had been raised to support the application, and everything looked good. As he walked out of the council chamber up to the station yard, he encountered one of the demolition contractor's men armed with oxyacetylene lamps, compressors and wrenches. As he stood and watched, he witnessed the removal of the first rivet on the line. It was all over. The battle was lost. It was the end of the Kingsbridge branch.